looks like we're working now. We're online, so let's go ahead and get started. Um, so yeah, we're going to be in Acts 12 today. This is an interesting lesson. There's one verse in here in particular that I had a lot of trouble with early on. A lot of people stumble over this one verse, and I want to dig into that a little bit. But the story is the Jewish leaders are at it again, and they're killing another one of the apostles and taking Peter into custody. So we've seen a lot of great things happening. We saw that they were called Christians first at Antioch. We see there at the end of chapter 11, and that we note in verse 28 that Claudius Caesar had begun to oppress the religious people, the Christians, and it says in verse 28 that there was a great dearth throughout all the world, and they began to try to send relief to the churches via Barnabas and Saul. So they were kind of the first two missionaries, if you will, that the church of Antioch began to send out to help with a lot of this chaos that was starting to break out again. There was a little bit of rest when Saul went back home to his hometown, but we see here everything's getting stirred back up again, and it's pretty aggressive. And we see here in chapter 12, King Herod is involved. And now this is the third King Herod that we've come across since the birth of Jesus. So the guy that built the temple, Herod's temple, which was the main Jewish temple, that was Herod the Great, is what we call him. Now when Jesus was on trial with Pilate, Pilate didn't want to have anything to do with it, so he sent him to Herod to see what he wanted to do. Well, that was a different Herod. So that was Herod's son. So that was Herod Antipas was his name. So this was the Herod who tried to kill Jesus as an infant when he sent the commandment to kill all the kids. That was Antipas's dad. So Antipas grew up hearing about this guy Jesus. And he even said, I've been wanting to meet you. I've heard a lot about you. I'm hoping you can do some magic tricks for me. Kind of, he was wanting to see some fireworks. And Jesus never even spoke a word. And he said, this guy's crazy. Send him back to Pilate. I can't do anything with him. So that was the second Herod. Now this Herod is the third one. This is Herod Antipas's nephew. So we kind of have a family lineage. So this is the third King Herod since the birth of Jesus. And this is Antipas's nephew, and this is King Agrippa, is his name. So, historically, that's what Herod we're talking about. And it says, about that time meaning as the strain and the great dearth talked about in chapter 11 was going throughout the land, and Barnabas and Saul were beginning to go do some ministry work. About that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hand to vex certain of the church. So those certain seem to be the leaders. And it says that he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. So here we see the first of the 12 apostles actually get murdered. Stephen was the first deacon murdered. And of course Saul was consenting to that. We read that a few chapters back. And now here they're going after the actual apostles. So where it says certain of the church, I believe they're going after the main people that orchestrated all this, which were the original followers of Christ. So James, that is one of the very first two. So we have Peter and Andrew, James and John were the very first four disciples who were selected. So this is John, who is the book of John, and the book of Revelation, John, and 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. This is his brother, James. James the Great, I think, is where one of the passages refers to. They refer to one as Big James, or James the Great, and James the Less. James the Less, not necessarily that he was less important, but he was, from what we understand, is the book of James, the guy who wrote the book of James in the Bible.
The Less?
The Less is.
Right, okay.
And that was Jesus's half-brother. So he had 4 brothers, at least, that we know of. One of them's name was James. And James the Less is who they refer to
I have
him.
a question.
Yes.
At one point, his family, well, except for Mary, and I don't know if Joseph was still alive or not.
Right, we know very little about Joseph.
And, which makes sense. But they did not believe in Jesus.
Right.
Was James the Less one who did or didn't? And
Well, we
came
know,
around.
right, we know he did, at least after the resurrection. There's one piece of evidence that alludes to the idea that he could have been one of the original 12.
Right. I always thought of him, but also
Because he's
knew
listed.
There's the story.
Right. He's listed from the research that I've done back in Acts 1. We kind of went through this. I think it was Acts 1. In Acts 1 chapter 13, we're given a list of the apostles or disciples. And it says Judas, the brother of James. And there is a list of names in Matthew 10, Mark 3, and Luke 6, all of Jesus' brothers. And it's possible that Judas and James were of the 12. This being James the Less, or James of the book of James.
Yeah, because who was chosen to be a disciple, or an apostle after Judas?
That was Matthias.
Matthias.
Right.
Okay, so he had to have been
Right. One of the original.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so which brings up the question, did he believe in him? Was he just tagging along? Of course, we know Judas wasn't really a true believer either. Mm-hmm. He was just tagging along. He was interested financially for his own gain. So it opens up a few questions in there.
I would think that when they first followed Jesus, they weren't really following him. That's just
as the Messiah. Yeah.
As the Messiah, but partly because John says, "Go, follow him."
Right.
John the Baptist.
Right.
And
they're learning all this, in the process.
Right.
So it is some interesting things to think about. But the James that is killed here is actually the brother of John, James. So he's killed. We see this. He's killed by the sword. And then it says in verse 3, this is where it gets interesting in verse 4 at least. It says, and because he saw it pleased the Jews, meaning Herod. So some backstory about Herod. Herod is Jewish. All the Herods were Jewish, at least by ethnicity. But they were, of course, put in their positions by the Roman government. Mm-hmm. So they were highly influenced by the Roman culture, more so than the Jewish culture. And they kind of fell in somewhere in between, I think, the two concepts. And here it says that Herod saw that it pleased the Jews. Now, why would it please the Jews? Well, it's because the Jews were still saying Jesus was a blasphemer. We got rid of that guy. Now these people are trying to keep this going. We got to get rid of them too. So it's kind of interesting that he's not really included in the Jews. It's like he saw it please the Jews, like he's kind of separate from the Jews.
Well, it would have to be.
Right.
He was sort of bound down to the Romans.
Exactly. So the Romans, this ties into verse 4, why I'm introducing this.
Excuse me.
Bless you. This ties into verse 4, which is why I'm kind of going into this. What we need to understand about Herod is that he is bound to the Romans. The Romans are what we call a pagan culture. So Christmas is a big holiday where this comes up. Some points of contention of Christmas trees, Christmas wreaths, apple cider. All these traditions that we do at Christmas are actually Roman pagan traditions. And so Herod is more directed towards the Roman pagan worship system than he is the Jews. But here he discovers that he killed one of these original 12, and it pleased the Jews, so he proceeded further to take Peter also, it says. And here's where we get some pieces of exactly what's happening in context of a holiday being celebrated right here at this point. It says, then were the days of unleavened bread. That's important to the sequence of what we're about to find out in verse 4. It says, and when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison. So Herod goes after Peter, catches him, puts him in prison, delivers him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Now, depending on what version of the Bible you're reading, that word Easter is stated as Passover.
Mine is.
So the only Bible, except I think the Geneva Bible, the only other one that I'm aware of that uses the word Easter is the King James. So this brings up a question. I had this discussion with a guy I taught with in North Carolina, and he basically challenged my faith and almost lost his over the fact that the word Easter is in the Bible. Because Easter was not an official declared holiday until the year 325. That was the Council of Nicaea, where they all got together. Some of that was pertaining to the books being selected for canonization, the selection of the date for Christmas, the selection of the date for Easter. Even Halloween used to be tied to the Catholic Church of All Hallows Eve, and it was an effort to evangelize the pagan world. A lot of this is trying to bring pagans and Christians together through these holiday celebrations. That's why at Christmas we have the Christmas tree, which is a Roman pagan symbol, and the wreath, which is a Roman pagan symbol, and the caroling and the wassailing. That was a Roman practice as people went through the town drinking wassail, which was a drink back in that day. All that's Roman, and it's all pagan, but we've adopted it in because in the year 325 there was an effort of the church to say, let's try to bring people in of the pagan side of things to win them for Jesus. I mean, it was an honest effort in the beginning. But the question does come up, how did the word Easter end up in Acts when it was in the year 50 or mid 40s possibly at this time? Where did that come? So that kind of threw this guy off the rails with his faith, and he asked me about it. I was new to preaching, and I didn't know either, and I questioned it. I'm like, what in the world why is the word Easter in there, and should it be Passover? So I thought, well, maybe it just should be Passover because all the other versions say Passover. There's an issue with that, and that verse 3 tells us during the current Jewish celebration, it was the days of unleavened bread. So the way that works in the Jewish culture is, if you go all the way back to the Exodus story, God said, put the blood on the doorpost, and when the death angel will come, he will pass over. So Passover was the first day.
Right.
As Pharaoh said, okay, y'all get out here, because he kicked them out at that point. After the Passover itself, they were told to eat in a certain way, to be clothed, to be ready, to make your food without yeast in it, which is what unleavened bread is.
Right.
because when you leave, when he lets you all go, you're going to have to grab what you can and leave, and you're going to be on a journey for a while, and you don't want your food going bad. You don't need the yeast in there to produce mold and all this. So the days of unleavened bread is following Passover. So Passover comes first. Then are the 7 days of unleavened bread as they were leaving Egypt and heading to where God was going to show them to go. So here, my question was, well, if he intended after Easter to bring him forth to the people, or if we say after Passover to bring him forth to the people, well, it was already after Passover, because they were in the days of unleavened bread, after the Passover had already occurred. So the way that works is Passover is the first day, then you have 7 days of unleavened bread. Well, they're already in the 7 days of unleavened bread, according to verse number 3. So that just didn't make sense to me of, well, if he's intending to keep him until after Passover, it's already after Passover. So what's up with that? One explanation is, well, they call the entire week the Passover, and it could have been a general term, which makes sense, but still doesn't explain how Easter got in this verse. So I did a lot of studying on this. I actually wrote a whole chapter about it in one of my books. So this word Easter, keeping in mind that Herod was pagan. Primarily, he was a pagan worshiper. If you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, we read a story, I'll flip back there, of the descendants of Noah. So Noah, of course, him and his sons repopulated the planet. We know, the best that we can track it down, that the flood occurred in around 2250 or 2300 BC. And that's significant to this story. So the date of the flood was around 23 BC. After the flood, we see that I think it was Genesis 12. No, Genesis
12.
Genesis 10, actually, I think. Let me find it here. There is a great grandson. Let's see. It's probably in here, actually, in my book. There was a great grandson of Noah. It's Genesis 10, my bad. It's Genesis 10, verses 8 and 9 is where that's at. So 10, 8, 9. And one of the great grandsons of Noah, his name is Nimrod. And we kind of make fun of that name. You know, Nimrod, we kind of use it as a derogatory name. But Nimrod was actually a very influential person. It says in verse 8 of Genesis 10, and Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord. And then verse 10 tells us his influence. It says that, and the beginning of his kingdom, so he was a king, obviously, was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Now, how did he become a king? Well, we don't know, biblically speaking, but we do know he was a great-grandson of Noah, that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, a mighty one in the earth, and he had a kingdom which began at Babel. Of course,
mine also says he who became a mighty warrior.
Warrior, yes.
On earth. So he just probably, as a warrior, that's how a lot of kings came into existence.
That's true, because they're very aggressive and very just a great leader in that area. So then chapter 11 is the story of the Tower of Babel. So you've got that. But here's the pagan background on that. So the Bible doesn't tell us any of this, but pagan tradition and history that we can go back tells us, and I wrote about this in here as well, Nimrod, one of the versions of this story, is that Nimrod married a woman named Semiramis. I think is how you pronounce that. Semiramis. Semiramis. Semiramis was an absolute crazy person. She was a queen, which is how we believe he became king of the kingdom, because he married into it. So the pagan story goes that Semiramis had a kingdom somehow, and she claimed that she was a moon goddess. Okay? And she came to earth from the moon in a moon egg that released exactly released from the moon and landed in the Euphrates River. And she hatched from this egg and became this queen, or a moon goddess. And so this is the woman that Nimrod chose to be his wife. Maybe that's why we call it.
As crazy as she was.
Yeah, evidently. And there's 2 or 3 versions of this story that I've researched. One of them is that Semiramis was actually Nimrod's mother. There's one version of the story.
Okay.
And that he married his own mom in order to become a king. The other version of the story is that so follow up the first version. The first version is he married his own mother, became a king, and then because he was a warrior, he was out in the battlefields a lot, and
What happened to his father?
Do what?
What happened to his father?
Exactly. I'm not sure where all that came from.
Okay.
So it would have had to have been Noah's grandson would have been Nimrod's father.
Right.
Cush was his name. But anyway, yeah, so it's a weird story. So I don't know that I fully buy the pagan version of this, but
All those gods and goddesses stories are weird.
exactly. So the story goes that Nimrod gets killed in battle, and his body is completely chopped up. And they were trying to find all of his body to put it back together to bring him back to life. But they couldn't do so, so they just said, well, he is now gone on to the sun to be a sun god. And then that version of the story says that Semiramis conceived their son through a sunbeam that came from the sun, because that's where Nimrod went. They hadn't had any kids yet. So Nimrod goes to the sun to be a sun god. Through a sunbeam that comes down and shines upon her, within her is conceived to be their son, named Tammuz is his name. So Tammuz is a child. He grows up in the kingdom. She's still the queen, and he has this absolute fascination with bunny rabbits. So he spends a lot of his time out in the field playing with the rabbits. But one day while he's out playing with the rabbits, he is brutally torn apart by a wild boar. Okay? And he dies. And the story goes, since he was the product of a sun god and a moon goddess, that he then resurrected from the dead and went to the sun to live with his father as a sun god. Okay, so this story has its roots back around 2100 BC, which was 150 years, 200 years after the flood. So that makes sense that this lady did exist during this time. Of course, her actual story is completely off the rails. There's another version of the story that Tammuz was actually her own son, and she married him, and the same story about how he got torn up in pieces and then went to... But the idea is this is where we're going with this. The story is all about a resurrection and a child going to back and reunite with his father. And her name in some versions of this story is Ishtar. Instead of Semiramis, her name is Ishtar. So they call the holiday Ishtar. That's the actual name of the holiday, because that's her name and kind of her story. Another goddess of that time was called Estros, which was a fertility goddess. Well, either way you go at it, that tells us where the word Easter came from. So in context, Herod, was a pagan worshiping this holiday called Ishtar, or Estros, whichever you want to apply in there. And it says here, he was intending after Easter to bring Peter before the people. So it wasn't the Passover that he was concerned with. He, being a pagan and a Roman, was worshiping all this other stuff going on. And that is where we get our idea for Easter. Of course, our true context is Christ resurrecting from the dead.
Right.
But that explains where the rabbits and the bunnies, the bunny rabbits and the eggs and all that, it all goes back to this pagan holiday celebrating this crazy woman who said she was the product of a moon egg, and her son loved bunny rabbits, and that's how all that gets tied into the story. And the resurrection was a story that goes back 2,000 years before Jesus. But of course, the true context of Easter is we're celebrating a risen Savior, because he actually rose from the dead and walked around on the earth for 40 days, and we knew it to be true.
You know, and listening to you tell this story, I'm thinking, and excuse me, those idiots believed
Right.
all of that
Yeah.
other stuff. And yet, when Jesus came, those same idiots wanted to kill him.
Wouldn't believe his story.
Would not.
And they would believe the other.
And yet they'd believe all that other
Right.
stuff.
And of course, none of that comes from the biblical text,
Oh, I
but
know
it's
that,
all
but-
pagan, but it is mapped back to the same time period of when the flood occurred, shortly after the flood, which is amazing to me that just within 200 years of the flood happening, that this kind of story had its time to take root already.
From Noah,
Yeah,
who had-
from Noah's people.
who had the most complete faith. I think of anyone on earth at that time anyway, but
Right.
even now.
But it had already gone off the rails
how,
within a couple hundred years.
Exactly.
So that explains why the word Easter is in this Bible, and that's the true context of the word in the original Greek, is referring to the pagan holiday Easter. So all the other Bibles that use the term Passover kind of got it wrong, because the point of that is it's focusing on Herod being a pagan, and he's waiting to do this until after his holiday that he's celebrating is over with, of Easter or Ishtar or whatever you want to call it, before he brings Peter to the people. So that's what's going on, and Peter's sitting in prison during this waiting time till he waits until after the Easter holiday is over with, or Ishtar holiday as it would have been called back in his day. And so Peter's sitting here in prison, and it says that he was in prison, kept in prison, but prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. So he's sitting in prison. This painting behind me in this picture, that is the picture of him sitting there, and people are praying for him. And it says, and when Herod would have brought him forth, that same night Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and the keepers before the door kept the prison. So a lot of people make an issue with this as well, because verse 4, how many soldiers? 16. 4 quinterions. So that doesn't mean that there were 16 soldiers all the time surrounding Peter. It just means there were 16 of them chosen. And it sounds like 2 at a time were responsible for being chained to him at all times. So I'm sure they rotated out every so many hours or whatever. But there were 16 appointed to this mission. 2 of them at a time were being chained there. And it says, and keepers before the door kept the prison. So that may have been some of the other of the 16. So that's where Peter's at. He's sitting in jail. That's where Herod, the reason Herod is pausing is because he's all celebrating Easter bunnies and moon egg ladies and all the rest of the stuff. And it says, all of a sudden, in verse 7, behold, the angel of the Lord came unto him, and a light shined in the prison, And he, that's the angel, he smote Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, "Arise up quickly." And his chains fell off from his hands. They kind of get the imagery of that. He walks over and just smacks Peter for some reason. I'm not sure why he hit Peter on the side, but he hit him. He smote him, it says. And when he stood up, it says his chains just fell off of his hands. And the angel said to him, "Gird thyself and bind on thy sandals." So he did, and he said unto him, "Cast thy garment about thee, and follow me." And went out and followed him, and wist not that it was true which was done by the angel, but he thought he saw a vision. Of course, Peter has been seeing visions recently. He was on the rooftop of Simon the tanner's house, and he saw this vision of all this stuff. And then he goes and tells Cornelius and his people about his vision. So he's thinking this is just another vision, and he's dreaming or something. Maybe that's why he hit him, to try to let him know this isn't a dream.
Well, that could be possible, because I'd be looking back at those chains to make sure that
Right, I'd be
I'm on
like,
me.
I'd be thinking, am I still hooked here? And so he thought he saw a vision. It says, but then they were past the first and the second ward, and came to the iron gate that led into the city, which opened to them of its own accord. So they're walking towards the gate, and it just opens up by itself, which is pretty amazing.
I would think, boy, this is some vision.
Yeah. And it says, and they went out and they passed through on one street, so that basically they got a block away or a street away from where they were at, and forthwith the angel departed from him. So Peter's in prison, he gets smacked, chains fall off, and he's following this angel, and they're about a block out of the city, or from the gate anyway, and all of a sudden the angel disappears. And there's Peter just standing there by himself. It says, and when Peter was come to himself, so I'm sure he stood there for a minute, and he was, like we do, we pinch ourselves. He's like, okay, did this really happen? Am I really standing here? What's going on? He comes to himself, and he says, now I know of a surety that the Lord hath sent his angel, and delivered me out of the hand of Herod, and from all the expectation of the people of the Jews. So he realizes this has actually happened. And so the first place he goes is to John Mark's house. So this is Mark of the Bible. So the guy that wrote the Gospel of Mark, this is Mark. And he goes to his house. He says, when he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, and where many were gathered together praying. Obviously, from what I could gather, this is the group that was praying for him over here in verse 5. Or it says the church was praying for him without ceasing of the church. So he goes to where the only place he knew to go. This is pretty significant in that Mark ends up becoming a traveler of Paul. He's a travel companion to Paul. And one of the questions that comes up in my mind and in others is, who was Mark? How does he get tied into all this? He was not one of the 12. He was not one of the 12 disciples. He was not one of the 12 apostles. He's not mentioned until now. So how did he know what to write down? Well, the history tells us that he evidently has spent a lot of time with Peter. And that's why this was his first place to go.
Yeah.
So Peter knew Mark. Mark was a disciple, one of the hundreds that were following Jesus. And most of his information, I'm sure that he was gathering, was information that he had gathered from talking to Peter firsthand. He also was potentially, I forget the exact context, but he was potentially lurking kind of in the background of all this stuff going on with Jesus when Jesus was alive. There's a story, it's in Mark, I forget the exact context, but it talks about a man who was wrapped in some type of a cloak in the cemetery I think it's when when Jesus was taken into custody and Peter smote the ear and all that. And Mark throws this weird little story in there about some guy standing off to the side, and he ran away naked. He dropped his cloak and ran off naked.
Yeah.
A lot of historians and theologians believe that this is Mark, and he was talking about himself because he was very curious of the whole story, and he was actually there
Okay, now,
the night that Jesus was taken into custody.
Acts, I've heard
Luke.
that it was Luke,
Luke.
but I've also heard it was Mark, so it's Luke.
Maybe it was a joint effort. Most people will give the credit to Luke.
Okay.
And Mark obviously wrote the Gospel of Mark.
Well, okay, in my early years, I never questioned it, but then
Right.
I've heard it preached on a couple of times, you know. But that's why I had the feeling that Mark not only hung around with Peter and the disciples, but he also hung around with Dr. Luke.
Possibly,
So,
yeah.
and it's,
And Luke, what we'll find out later, Luke was also a travel companion to Paul. He's referred to as Lucas and Luke on a couple of occasions. So we know that both John Mark and Luke, neither were of the 12 apostles, but both were at some point travel companions to Paul moving forward through the rest of the book of Acts. And of course, Mark evidently has a connection to Peter because this is the first place Peter goes. So this chapter really brings a lot of this together.
Yeah.
Oh, all these people knew each other and they were working together and helping each other. So anyway, the story goes that he goes to their house and Peter knocks at the door of the gate, and a damsel came to hearken named Rhoda. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. So he's knocking, trying to get in. She realizes it's him, and she's so excited she forgets to let him in. And she runs and tells everybody, "It's Peter." And she says, and they said unto her, "You're mad." But she constantly affirmed that it was even so. And they said, "It is an angel."
Peter's just,
And while this is going on, Peter's still out there knocking. Of course, he's afraid they're going to come get him. I mean, because he's now
I
gone
would be.
from prison. I'm sure they're looking for him at this point. And when they had when they had opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. But he, beckoning unto them with the hand to hold their peace, he's like, "Be quiet. They're looking for me probably. I need to get in here." Declared unto them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, "Go, show these things unto James and to the brethren." So this obviously is not John's brother James. This is Jesus' half-brother James and the brethren, meaning the brothers of Jesus. So obviously they're all here at John Mark's house as well. And they're all praying together, they're all serving together, and they're all together in one place. And he departed and went to another place. And as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers what was become of Peter. This was a big deal because they were intending, again, after the holiday of Easter, to bring him forth to be processed. It says, and when Herod had sought for him and found him not, he examined the keepers and commanded that they should be put to death. He was furious with this. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and there abode. Now the chapter concludes with a really weird and interesting ending with Herod. It says, and Herod was highly displeased with them of Tyre and Sidon, but they came with one accord to him, and having made Blastus, the king's chamberlain, their friend, desired peace because their country was nourished by the king's country. So there was some political stuff going on there, basically. And this was a big day for Herod, evidently. He was going to sit on his throne and declare a lot of great stuff that was going on. It says, and upon a set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat upon his throne and made an oration unto them. And here's where the people were with this and with Herod. Again, highly pagan, but he's in leader of a bunch of Jewish people. It says, and the people gave a shout, saying, it is the voice of a God and not of a man. Well, that didn't sit well with God. says, and immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory, and he was eaten of worms, and gave up the ghost.
Okay.
But the word of God grew and multiplied, and Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry, and took with them John, whose surname was Mark. So just weird, odd story there at the end, how this King Herod dies from some intestinal worm disease or something. Or it says that he's eaten of worms. They believe he had some type of something growing inside of him, and it just happened to happen on that day, or God ramped it up or something in that moment, and he dies. And then Barnabas and Saul, they're still traveling together, still doing the ministry, and here we see John Mark being brought into their missionary efforts, and the three of them begin on their journey as we look into chapter number 13. And Peter's released from the prison. Herod is dead, so Peter is now back and available to the group to be a leader, joining in their efforts. Kind of interesting stuff.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to close out online. Good to see you guys. Hopefully you found that informative. We'll be in chapter 13 next week, so we'll see you guys then.